So, hello everyone, and today I thought it might be useful to look at some of the myths surrounding cannabis. And I think there are several myths associated with cannabis, and probably one of the topics that I think most people will be familiar with is around cannabis and psychosis. So there's a very clear divide, I think, in most people's opinions. Some people are very clear that cannabis has no association with psychosis or mental health problems, and on the other side people opposing that, saying it almost is causal if not associated. So it's just one example really of where there are very strong views around the role that drugs play in mental health and health more generally. But rather than trot over that, because I think those arguments are quite well worn and to some degree I think have been over-researched, I think we've probably reached the limit of what we're ever going to find out about cannabis and psychosis. For what it's worth, my view is there is an association, but there are several factors we need to think about in making statements, or certainly advising clients and families when it comes to talking about the risk of cannabis and psychosis. So instead, today I wanted to look at something that maybe hasn't received as much attention as I think it should have done, and that's to do with cannabis and dependency or addiction. And I think for many people, they don't think that cannabis is something that you can become dependent on, or certainly don't see it as being as risky as drugs like cocaine and opiates or heroin. And when I started to look at this, what became apparent was that we're using data that's now 25 years old to talk about the risk of cannabis dependency. So in the States, a large epidemiological survey was done in the mid-90s, and a figure emerged out of that survey that showed that roughly 1 in 10 regular users of cannabis risk becoming dependent, and that's both physically and psychologically dependent. Now that figure's been used over consistently in media reports and research to some degree. So I thought I'd take a look at that and just see what I could find out about how reliable that figure is and what different factors there might be that are influencing the way that figure is arrived at. So 1 in 10, as you appreciate, is quite a lot. It doesn't sound a lot, but when you think there are millions of people using cannabis across the world, and even in the UK, hundreds of thousands of regular users. So once you start saying 10% of them are at risk of developing dependency, that adds up to thousands of people who potentially are at risk of dependency. So to give you one example of where I think we've got problems with our understanding or even the headcount around cannabis and dependency, if we look at the way females in particular are at risk of cannabis dependency and how that assessment is made, I think we have some problems. So the main criteria that's used is something called DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, and the other manual or other set of assessments internationally used is the International Classification of Disease, sometimes referred to as ICD. And those have various iterations. So ICD-10, I think, is where we're at now, and DSM-5 is where we're at with the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. Now, DSM, up until very recently, used criteria or included criteria that would ask questions trying to ascertain whether someone had cannabis dependency. And some of these questions I think were quite sexist. So for instance, one of the questions was, have you ever been intoxicated while driving a truck or operating heavy machinery? Now clearly that's something that I think there are more likely to be men who would answer affirmatively to that than women, even in 2019. So I think that's one example, but another example is probing around convictions for cannabis, and again I think that skews us towards finding more men than women, because we know men are more likely to have convictions related to drugs, including cannabis, than women. So just two examples of where I think we might have underestimated, using those criteria, the number of women who have a problem with cannabis dependency. I think just to finish with, the other thing I would just leave you with is I think our understanding of what works in terms of treatment for people who develop cannabis dependency is still very, very limited. We obviously have no substitute drugs like we do for heroin. So what we're left with is non-pharmaceutical interventions, and talking therapies, as they're sometimes referred to, don't show much difference between the different varieties when it comes to helping people with cannabis problems. So I think we've a lot to do, both in terms of understanding exactly how many people have a problem with cannabis, and then how we can support and help them to really get free of that and come out the other side. Be interested to hear your comments, and you can post those online.